filed for divorce from your husband.
Correct.
Kevin, after nearly 22 years of marriage.
Correct.
And
25 years being together.
Being together.
Correct.
And because of his infidelity.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
You know, infidelity is one thing. A full baby is a whole nother topic.
What if the woman who destroyed Whitney Houston's reputation in public was secretly fighting the exact same battle in private? What if every cruel thing Wendy Williams ever said about Whitney wasn't hatred at all, but something far darker: recognition? And what if the most important thing Wendy Williams ever said on television wasn't about gossip, wasn't about ratings, and came 2 days after it was already too late? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never see either of these women the same way again. Wendy Joan Williams was born on July 18, 1964, in Asbury Park, New Jersey, a coastal town that produced Bruce Springsteen songs and blue-collar dreams, and the particular loneliness of people who felt too big for the world they were born into. She grew up in Ocean Township, youngest of 3 children. Her father, Thomas Williams, was a teacher. Her mother, Shirley, a school librarian. Her brother and sister were, by most accounts, the children her parents understood. Wendy was the one they spent years trying to figure out. She was loud when silence was expected, blunt when tact was required. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. She was fascinated by gossip, by the gap between what people showed publicly and what was really happening behind closed doors. School wasn't a refuge. It was a daily reminder that she didn't fit. She was tall, large-framed, opinionated, in a culture that rewarded smallness and compliance. She later recalled those years with a single devastating sentence: "I was never the pretty one. I was never the popular one. I survived school. I didn't enjoy it." Survival, not enjoyment. There's a world of pain inside that distinction. What saved her was radio. In her teenage years, Wendy discovered that a voice could be a weapon, a passport out of invisibility. She studied communications at Northeastern University in Boston, but she wasn't just learning broadcasting. She was building an identity, assembling a persona out of every social rejection she had ever absorbed, and turning it into a broadcast signal. Her early career was turbulent by design, fired more than once, consistently pushing content further than anyone wanted her to go. She talked about sex, drugs, celebrity secrets, and the private lives of public figures with a directness that terrified management and electrified listeners. By the early 1990s, Wendy Williams had found her home, first at WDAS in Philadelphia, then at Hot 97 in New York, where her morning show became one of the most listened-to programs in the city. She called herself the queen of all media. She named names, she connected dots, and she did it all with a laugh that made cruelty sound like a public service. But behind the microphone, something else was happening. What very few people knew was that Wendy was fighting a cocaine addiction that had wrapped itself around her life long before fame made her a household name. She has spoken about it since, in fragments, in careful disclosures, in the kind of confessions that come out sideways rather than all at once. She started using during her radio years, in the world of late nights, green rooms, and the particular loneliness of being the loudest person in every room while feeling completely hollow when the microphone went off. The addiction wasn't a secret to everyone. Industry insiders whispered, but in the world of shock radio, erratic behavior was often indistinguishable from brand identity. The line between Wendy performing and Wendy unraveling was deliberately blurred, and she worked hard to keep it that way. Meanwhile, in a completely different galaxy of fame, Whitney Houston was ascending. The kind of stardom that only comes along once or twice in a generation. The kind where your voice alone is enough to make a room go still. They would not collide publicly for years, but the collision, when it came, would be spectacular, ugly, and in retrospect entirely inevitable. By the late 1990s, Wendy had quietly and with enormous difficulty begun confronting her own addiction. She entered treatment. She relapsed. She entered again. The war was private and prolonged and nowhere near finished. And it was during this specific window, when Wendy herself was most raw, most frightened about what the drugs were doing to her life, that she began talking about Whitney Houston on air. She discussed Whitney's rumored drug use openly, before it was confirmed, before major publications would touch it. She named specific substances. She described what people around Whitney allegedly witnessed. She was relentless. She was graphic. She was, in the purely clinical sense of the word, accurate. Whitney's camp was furious. Bobby Brown issued statements. Lawyers were involved. Radio stations received pressure. The message from every direction was identical. You have gone too far this time. Wendy did not retreat. She doubled down. And then, in 2003, she did something that would define her public identity for the next 2 decades. She sat across from Bobby Brown in a radio interview and she went to work. She pushed. She probed. She asked the questions no mainstream outlet would touch. And Bobby Brown, who was not known for careful media navigation, said things that reverberated far beyond that studio. The interview became a cultural event. It painted a portrait of Whitney Houston that was unflattering in the extreme. A portrait of addiction, dysfunction, and a marriage that appeared to be consuming both people inside it. And Wendy Williams was cemented. Fearless, ruthless, the most dangerous voice in the industry. What she was not publicly was vulnerable. Here is the fact that reframes everything. When Wendy Williams described Whitney's addiction on air, when she named substances and behaviors and warning signs with a specificity that shocked even jaded observers, she was not speaking from a position of moral superiority. She was someone who recognized the symptoms because she had experienced them. Someone who understood the psychology of denial because she had practiced it. She was narrating her own shadow while pointing at someone else's. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in her hotel room at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles, submerged in the bathtub. She was 48 years old. The cause of death was determined as accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. Over 200 million records sold. Gone. The entertainment industry didn't just pause. It stopped. In the way it only stops when something genuinely irreplaceable has been lost. Wendy Williams went on air 2 days later, February 13, 2012. The show was already scheduled. The audience was already seated. The cameras were already positioned. And Wendy sat in that chair, under those lights, in front of the live audience she had spent 4 years building. And she did not do hot topics. She cried. Not the contained, quickly managed tears that television personalities allow themselves when sentiment is required. She cried in the way people cry when something has broken through every defense they have ever constructed and reached something real underneath. Her voice cracked. She stopped speaking. She started again and stopped again. And then she said it. She told her audience that she had been harder on Whitney Houston than on almost anyone else in her career. She did not minimize it. And then she explained why. She said she had been in recovery herself. That the addiction she had covered so relentlessly in Whitney's life was a disease she knew personally. That when she looked at Whitney Houston and described what she saw, she was in some way describing what she had fought to escape. That the famous 2003 interview had come from a place she had never fully examined until that moment. She was not excusing herself. She was explaining herself. And there is a difference that matters enormously. I saw my own demons in her, she said. I covered her the way I covered her because I knew exactly what she was going through. And I never said that. I never admitted that. And now she's gone. The cruelty wasn't cruelty. It was recognition. It was fear. It was Wendy looking at Whitney and seeing what she was most terrified of becoming. The audience in that studio didn't know how to respond. The usual energy, the laughter, the communal judgment was entirely suspended. Something real was happening. And everyone in the room understood it. The media covered the moment briefly, called it touching, called it emotional, and then moved on. But what actually happened on that stage was not a tribute. It was a reckoning. The most honest thing Wendy Williams ever said in public, and the industry largely failed to recognize it as such. Whitney Houston never knew. She died without ever hearing Wendy Williams explain why the coverage had been what it was. She died without the context that might have reframed years of public exposure as something more complicated than cruelty. That is one of the facts about this story that resists easy resolution. But the confession reaches us. It reaches anyone who has ever attacked in someone else the thing they most feared in themselves. Anyone who has ever been the loudest critic of a struggle they were quietly losing. anyone who has ever pointed at someone else's visible wound to keep attention away from their own. Whitney Houston gave the world a voice that will outlast everyone who ever spoke kindly or cruelly about her. Her music is still playing. It is still making people stop what they are doing and feel something they hadn't expected to feel. Wendy Williams gave the world something smaller, but no less real. She gave it one unscripted moment of honesty so complete that it briefly made the entire apparatus of celebrity gossip feel as fragile and temporary as it actually is. Two women, two addictions, two very different kinds of fame. And between them, for one unscripted moment on a February morning in 2012, the truest thing that either of their stories ever produced. Not a performance, not content, just the truth.